I've officially pushed the start record on this. I actually did put on pants because once I saw that video, the other one of the guy not wearing pants, I was horrified. I'd be the guy that screw stuff up with that. But anyway, I want to thank everybody for joining us. And it looks like the way these things work, they're going to come in as we go. And then just what we'll do. Kind of as a housekeeping matter, if you haven't already muted yourself, please do so. It'll just make life easier. I will go through and mute everybody but Nick unless I do this wrong. And then what way we'll proceed on this is I will be monitoring the chat box. And as questions emerge, Nick will either work them into his presentation or he's also arranged for some time towards the end, and we can make this go however we want to. And our plan is to make this run about an hour. And you know how these things work. If everybody's enjoying the conversation and it's good stuff, we can go on for much longer. If you're not enjoying it, what we can do is adjourn earlier. So that being said, I'm going to kick this off. Hello, everybody. I'm Jim Leggett. I'm the second vice president of FSA. And I guess one of the things in my portfolio is membership, which is something we should all care about. And when we did the raffle, I still feel like Wayne and Garth from Wayne's World, where I'm doing a public access station show in my basement. But I'm coming to you from an undisclosed location in Starkville, Mississippi. And what we have here, and I'll throw the floor over to him a second. If I knew how to do this, I'll expand the view so Nick comes up first. Now I'm not going to do that because I'll screw it up. But anyway, in just a second, I'm going to give the floor to Nick Hayes. Nick will be our speaker today. I got to know Nick, I guess it's about 5 years ago, and we were lamenting the state of sailing in Jackson, and one of our fleet members had said, "Hey, I read this book called Saving Sailing from this guy named Nick Hayes." So I read it, and while I was talking with her, she said, "Do you think he'd come to talk to us?" And I said, "Well, I could ask him." And Nick came about 5 years ago, and I think we solved all of Jackson Yacht Club sailing problems. And then Nick and I turned our conversation to solving all the rest of the world's problems. And then I took him to such delicacies as the trading post in off Pelahatchie Bay. And the best way I can describe it is part deer camp, part redneck chic. But it's a unique atmosphere, is it not, Nick? And it's one of those places we've all been to. It's just kind of fun to do. Nick, his day job is a business consultant. And he kind of thinks like I do about business problems. And he applied those skills to the sport of sailing. And he's wrote that book. And I gave everybody a homework assignment called Saving Sailing. You should take some time to read it. He periodically writes in Sailing Magazine and others. And when he's not talking about sailing, he has a B-25, which you sail out of Milwaukee.
I had a B-32, and I recently sold it and got something bigger. So, but we can talk about that at a later date.
Yeah, and then I hope you guys enjoy it. And Nick's also unique, where he lives outside Milwaukee, and he lives in I think a fair way to say it was an undiscovered lost treasure of Frank Lloyd Wright. And there's a book coming about it in the near future.
That's correct. You're actually looking at his architecture right here behind me. This is a crazy room you're looking at, but we'll talk about that too on a later date, not for today.
Yeah, it wasn't the agenda for today, but I see Nick's brought his appropriate beverage. Nick, I'm going to give you the floor. I'm going to monitor the chat line, and then if you're like me, you may or may not be able to do both at the same time. So we'll take it from there. All right, Nick, it's all yours, sir.
Sounds great. So, Jim, do monitor that chat line and let me know if there are questions that you think need to be talked about in the middle. The only thing I'm worried about is I think you have to give me, let me see if I can get a host.
I give you presenter privileges, which should get you where you need to be.
Yeah, so let me find the sharing for.
If not, I can.
I apologize, but I can't find the sharing tool. Let me see if I can get.
It's only because I lost my sharing privileges, so I'll make you a host. I know that'll work.
I got it. I got it now. Here, now the button
Okay,
is
good.
available. So yeah, so give me a second while I bring up
Okay.
the screen. All right, I'm gonna share this screen right here, and then I'm gonna bring over a presentation to it, and hopefully this will. Give me a second. Not quite right yet. Try that again.
So I can make you a host, and I'll get to the same place.
Yeah, why do we? Tell you.
Wait a minute, something's happening.
I think you ought to.
All right, you got it.
Great. So let me do one more thing. I want to make sure I have this set up so that it presents on the right screen. Give me just a second, and I'll be with you.
That's why I think we're kind of like, I'm sure Nick remembers Wayne's World. Every time I do one of these, I kind of feel like Wayne's World.
I sure do. Oh, shoot, coming up on the wrong screen. Let me give me one more second. I'm almost ready.
Okay, you got a slideshow. We're in business.
Sounds great. So when Jim asked me to do this, thanks everybody for joining. It's really cool to see an association get together virtually this way. Obviously, some pretty significant dedication to the members, and that's to your credit. It's you know, I'm up here in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, where we'd be putting our boats in the water, and everything's on hold at the moment, and so better than at least we want to talk about it. So that's what we're going to do here today for just a few minutes. Jim gave a great introduction. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on why I took this challenge back about 10 years ago when the first book I wrote called Saving Sailing was written. I was the market research oriented member of my local club, and also a volunteer at our local community sailing center, which is the organization that does all of the training of newbie and wannabe sailors here in Milwaukee. It was a dinghy club originally that was started with a $1 lease on some landfill on the Milwaukee Bay, and a bunch of donations from the Harkin Company, because Harkin happens to be just a few minutes away, and the Harkin brothers and all their cohorts were all dinghy sailors. So the Milwaukee Community Sailing Center stood up on a piece of land and let people rent a little space and threw in some cranes, and from there a bunch of one design sailing started. Up here it was 420s. There were some 470s. There are some Solings and some of that still left. Some bigger keel boats because of the freshwater, and I as a volunteer in these organizations was always charged as the researcher for trying to understand why the membership was in decline. And so I took that challenge on, did some research, interviewed about 5,000 sailors around the world from about 2006 to 2009 to try to understand what was going on in their minds and their psyche, and wrote a book about it. And ever since, I've been traveling the country and frankly the hemisphere, talking with organizations that care about essentially youth sports and mentoring and this activity of sailing that we all try to spend so much time doing. And so what I've done here is boil that presentation down to something that I think might be useful to you as association members. And my agenda for today is to spend about 40 minutes just talking about the numbers, and I'm going to surprise you, I think, a bit with a conversation about the newcomers. And I'm going to come back to that in just a second, and then we'll explore some possibilities in terms of grabbing some of those newcomers and growing with them and learning from them. In fact, about a month ago, quickly, I just want to tell you one more short story before moving into slides. I was Facebook friended by a guy who'd created a YouTube channel about sailing, and he was all excited interview all the pros and all the experts, and he wanted me to watch a few of his videos and comment on them. And his goal was, I'm here to grow sailing. I care about more people on the water, and my YouTube channel is going to make that happen. And I thought for a few minutes about what I wanted to say to him about that, because he wanted some answers, right? He wanted to be told where to go. And the answer is sailing is growing. And that might come as a surprise to you, because that's not the news. But there are newcomers in this sport, and they're actually transforming it pretty significantly right under our noses. And I'm going to talk about that today in detail so that you can do something about it. Here are the numbers, though. Kind of what the chart shows, the number of folks who identified as sailors in North America, or in the United States, between 1949 and 2009, in a period where the population was actually ascending from 150 million to 300 million people. We went from about 1.5 million people recreationally sailing in wood boats in 49 to fiberglass exploding this idea in the late 50s, until about 12.5 million Americans were identifying as sailors, either cruisers or racers, in 1979. And then that began to fall off, and it was down to 2.6 million by 2009. A lot of kind of interesting theories around what happened around 1979, 1980 with that inflection point. Well, we don't need to spend a lot of time on it right now. Everybody looks at that and says, oh, that was the moment at which both parents needed to begin to go to work. That was the moment at which we began to take on more debt and we needed to work more. It was a moment in which suburbs were really exploding, and it became more difficult to get to places to go sailing. So you can make all sorts of excuses for the change in 1979, but it's really important to point out that if you I've got a note to annotate content. There you go. Thanks, Jim. If you look at population, you would think that we would have at least stayed up a little bit after 79, that the cultural changes can't have been that great. But in order to really understand this more deeply, we got to dig into who the people are. And so here's an age breakdown of the folks who sailed today and why, split out by percentage by age group. So on the bottom, less than 17 are kids under 17, right? And then the age group 18 to 24, and the age group 25 to 35, et cetera. And what you can see from this breakdown is probably pretty reflective of who we have in this room right here. I'm just guessing. I'm thinking that most of us probably fall between the age of 45 and 70 in this room. And I'm also guessing that if we were to ask ourselves what we were doing, say 25 or 30 years or so ago, what you'd find out is that we were the people who in our late 20s and early 30s were the ones who were doing the sailing back then. And so, oops, I've let my button go. I want to go back to that slide and show that to you one more time. Here we are.
It's not just me does stuff like that.
Sorry about that. So here we are. We'll back up 30 years, and you will see that this bubble of people who basically jumped on those first fiberglass boats being built in the late 50s and early 60s after the war, are the same people who are showing up in the room and doing their stuff. And I'll try not to hit play too quickly again. So let's move a little further and compare that breakdown to the U.S. population. And this is where things get a little bit more interesting. So what I've done here is I took the 2009 U.S. population by age group and overlaid it with sailors by age group. And what you can see here is that we dramatically underperform with kids. A lot of us boomers think that, when we're done, there won't be a U.S. The U.S. will be done with its people because the population was a huge balloon starting post-war. But the truth is, most of the United States is much younger. More kids in the United States than there ever have been. And frankly, there's a big bubble of folks between the ages of 25 and 45 right now. And if you look at it, those two groups are the groups that we don't attract into our sport, if you can imagine. And so something has changed, and I'm going to keep going with numbers for a minute to try to emphasize what has changed, and then we'll change the direction to the newcomers. So if you look at underperforming with kids, you have to ask the question, what about all these youth programs we've put in place? Jim shared a video that US Sailing put out a couple days ago that celebrated exactly what I think I'm saying here. There are more kids in sailing programs than ever in US history today, which is a pretty amazing thing. But the problem, and what wasn't talked about in that video, is that the retention rate of kids in sailing programs is actually quite low. And that's not very surprising. The fact is 95% of youth sailors don't sail after the age of 25. But the way to think about that is 95% of youth athletes aren't athletes after the age of 25. It's the same problem as, 10 of us in this room haven't taken piano lessons and only one of us still playing. So the issue is, and the headline speaks to it, kids sports are for kids, they're not for adults. And so what we really need to understand about the behaviors within sailing that drove us as now boomer sailors who just won't leave, we need to look at why it was we began sailing when we did. Here's a little bit of a clue. Your association might see something similar to this. This is one of my favorite charts. I'm going to pause here to tell you the story of how I got it. I was asked to do a talk at a Chicago yacht club, a very interesting smaller club that had a declining membership. And a young man on the board said, I want you to know who it is you're going to talk with before you show up. So let's do a survey of the members. And I thought long and hard about that and wanted to ask the right question to give us the most information about the club. And so what we asked, instead of saying, how old are you now? We said, how old were you when you joined and what year was it? And we got these data. And so if the way to read this is in 1960, when someone joined the club, their age was 33 years old. And in 2008, when somebody joined the club, let's use 2007 because it's more extreme, the age that they joined was 63. And so you can see this playing out actually in the clubs that we all visit. I know you guys are not a club, you're an association, but you depend upon the clubs for your infrastructure and some of your locations. So if you think about the way yacht clubs would have looked and felt in 1960, what the club was an aspirational place for middle-class families who wanted to be on the water. And so a husband and possibly a non-working wife and a couple of kids joined at the age of about 32 and showed up and started using the facilities as a foursome. In other words, the family joined and the kids showed up and everybody did their thing on the water. Sometimes they sailed together, sometimes they didn't, but the point was they all showed up on the weekends and sometimes on the weeknights. And if you think about it, we are those people. We're the product of that. We're the ones that were the kids that were being dragged along by our dads and moms. And fast forward 30 years or 40 years to 50 years to 2010. That was bad math on my part. Fast forward to today, now what we have is we have these organizations with aging memberships that are struggling to keep pace with their own infrastructure costs. And what they do is they put out these member recruitment programs and say, hey, we need more people down here eating burgers and sustaining this operation. So everybody call your friends and bring them down here. And what ends up happening, unfortunately, is all the 65-year-old people call their 65-year-old friends, and their 65-year-old friends join the club. and the age continues to climb. I'm going to hit approve on Ann's request. Or can you do that, Jim? Maybe I can do it.
What you need, Nick?
I'm going to hit Ann's got a request to annotate, and I just want to.
Yeah, you should be able to do that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think I did,
Yeah.
but,
Just answer yes, and then she can scribble on it.
yeah, I did it. Okay. So here we go. So that's the point of this slide. You can see what's been going on as the age goes up. Essentially, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's going to continue to go up. And that means that we are able now to use our chart to identify who doesn't go sailing. So we know there are all these kids programs, more kids in kids programs than ever before. And then there are people that look a lot like us, usually guys over the age of 50 or so who are participating in the sport. But the people who are not participating in the sport are these folks. These are families in suburbs, usually pretty far from their location, usually living kind of a screen lifestyle, that haven't found something that they can do together. And so that's the bad news. Those are the numbers that I wanted to try to deal with in the book. And frankly, I want to leave you with one last thought on this, because this was really the key finding of all of the research. So in this case, I took the number of sailors as a population, and I asked the question, in the year 1979, who were you sailing with? Or in the year 1959, who were you sailing with? What I learned is that when sailing was done in family groups, it was growing. And when we stopped doing it in family groups, oops, we age segregated, then it stopped growing. Now that's a bit of an indictment, cultural indictment, if you will. And I'm here now to tell you that there's actually really terrific new developments since 2009 that most of my writing and attention has been focused on, and that's where we're gonna go next.
And for our members out there, and I think you, Nick sees it too, you can tell the story of our association identical. Just change a few numbers, change a few faces, you got about the same story.
Yeah, great. Excellent. Thanks for the ad, Jim. So let's talk about the newcomers, because when this guy, asked me to comment on his YouTube blog so he could grow sailing, he said, I got to grow sailing. Well, sailing is growing. There are newcomers, and it's actually a really significant new development, but it's often hard for us to see. And one of the reasons it's hard for us to see is they're not the same kind of sailors that we're used to seeing. So I want to tell you a story about a group that I found in and around Minneapolis. So there's a little lake up near Minneapolis, a little freshwater lake, and the name of it escapes me, but I'll think of it as I'm speaking because I talk about it all the time. An older gentleman, an engineer from Germany named Werner Maybaum, had retired from 3M, and he walked the shorelines of this lake, and he lamented the fact that it didn't have lots of sails on it. He thought it was a perfect inland sailing lake. And so let me continue to tell the story. Werner had a memory of having grown up near a lakeside in Switzerland as a child, and he remembered at about the age of 7 of being approached on the shoreline by a man who asked if he'd like to go sailing on a sailboat, and he took a ride and he fell in love with the idea. And so as he is hiking around his community in Minneapolis looking at an empty lake, he realizes that what he'd like to do in retirement is take people for boat rides like the old man did when he was a kid. And so he contacted the local municipality who had a dock, and he asked for permission to tie up a boat. As long as he put life preservers on it and enough for passengers, he would be able to take people for rides for free. And he he's been doing it ever since. Now, I have to tell you, I believe Werner had a stroke a year or so ago, so he may not still be doing it in his way, but his legacy still lives because he recruited volunteers who now do the same thing. So I have to tell you that the way Werner does this is he'll walk the sidewalk, or he'll stand on the pier. Sometimes he'll strum a guitar, and when someone walks by, he'll offer them a ride. And if they pick up the offer, they go for a ride. Werner takes their picture. They become Facebook friends, and the next day he posts their picture to his Facebook group. And this is an example of the kind of photograph that's been taken by Werner. Now, I'm going to show you about 10 photographs taken by Werner, shown on his Facebook page, that I collected over the course of about a year to make a point. I want you to look at their faces and try to, in your own mind's eye, think about who these people are. What's the category of the group that is raising their hand and saying, sure, old man, I'll go for a ride with you. And here we go. So that is Werner driving his boat. You can see he was able to get a boat big enough to fill the cockpit with friends. Again, and there are some of his volunteers. I love this kid. Watch him. Here he is saying, somebody fix the leech cord. And so I have to ask, in your chat box, maybe comment on what you see here. Most people see is usually a preponderance of women, usually adult women, often bringing kids, with a diverse ethnicity, and really a willingness to have an adventure. And so what I'm about to tell you is that all of the growth in sailing in the last 15 years has been with a completely different group of people than I think most of the sailing community sees. And I'm going to show that to you next. Here's a chart. What this is an assessment, a total of the number of hours spent sailing in 1996 to begin with, and we're going to fast forward 10 years. So these are all of the hours of all of the participants spent on a sailboat. And white are the male hours, and orange are the female hours. So on the far left-hand side, these are the hours spent by all of the wealthy owners. These are folks that own TP52 programs and yachts in the Med, and things I can't touch, right? And as you would expect, not very many of the hours are actually contributed to by sailing by that group. And then there are the middle class owners. These are people who own sailboats. They might be 15 feet long, they might be dinghies, and they might be 50 feet long and stay at a marina someplace and use as a cruising boat. But male and female hours in 1996, you can see that about 1 in 7 of the hours spent on those sailboats were spent by women. Entry owners are people with brand new boats or who are just in it and involved in some sort of shared fleet program. So these are people who they've invested enough to learn how to sail. They can sail their own boat if they want to. It's a starter probably, or maybe they're in kind of a rent-to-own program or a club fleet. And again, 1 in 7 hours it was 1 in 7 women to men based on hours. And then finally, a really big group of sailors, and I don't think this is true with your association, but it is true with the rest of kind of club racing in the United States. These are crewmates and people who just go along for rides. These are participants in sailing, and you can see that they are, again, 1 hour for every 7 men who were in 1996 invited to go on in those programs. I will say that in racing, the participant is often the crewmate. So this could be quite a serious sailor, right? They might have spent 30, 40 years doing it, but they don't own their own boat. So that's how the participant breaks down. Now, I'm going to fast forward to 2006, and I want you to recognize the new hours in sailing based on gender. And here we go. So what you can see here is among wealthy owners, there aren't very many more new women. And among middle class owners, there are about twice as many hours spent on boats, women to men. About 3 times as many hours among women, among entry owners. And look at what's happening with participants. Women are absolutely dominating this, and I need to tell you that they're a special class of women that I'll describe in the next few minutes. Sailing is growing again. This is a story about my town. This is Milwaukee. This is Milwaukee Bay, and I apologize for the big keel boats in comparison with the boats you guys sail, but this is what we have. We've got a perf fleet here, right? So any boat anybody picked up off the scrapyard and made ready to go sailing is a racing boat. I need to tell you about this group formed about 30 years ago in Milwaukee called the Milwaukee Bay Women's Offshore Series, MBWOS. These were some wives and girlfriends and friends of men who got tired of sailing with men. And about 30 years ago said, we're going to commit Monday nights to women only. And they did. And so when they first began sailing, it was about 4 crews, and they would sail 1 race 6 times on Mondays and then have a championship series. And it's grown ever since. And now Monday nights are one of the busiest, most active sailing nights on Milwaukee Bay. So let me show you a few pictures from that. This is the kind of fleet you might see rounding a mark on a nice breezy night on Milwaukee Bay. You'll notice boats in the range of a J35 or a Tartan 10 or a Catalina 30. They're a couple of different fleets. There's a kind of a smaller fleet and a larger fleet. There are the more competitive boats and the less competitive boats. I need to tell you very specifically about this boat because this is a very good friend of mine. This woman named owns a boat called Helldiver, a Tartan 10, and you can see from the white caps that it's blowing a good 11, 12, maybe 13 knots from the southeast still, and they're on a downwind leg. And Sally is on the bow wrestling that big spinnaker pole on a jibe on her Tartan 10. And what needs to be said about this is this year, on this season, Sally and her crew had an average age of 73 years old. It's just an amazing thing to me. So all women aboard a boat that only has that has an average age of 73. And to counter that, I want to show you another picture, a proud one. My daughter, I have 2 daughters now beyond college, but this was back when they were teenagers. My 2 daughters and 2 daughters of a friend of mine and a couple of their friends all got together and fielded a team to try to go beat their moms using a J30. And so in this case, my daughter Elizabeth is driving this J30 upwind, and that resulted in actually quite a life lesson. They were recruited to go on to the J30 North Americans as a member of a co-ed team after having spent a season doing really well against the Milwaukee Women's Offshore Series. This is one of my daughters, in fact, who went ahead and did that in one of her own dinghies. And here they are at the J30 North Americans with their team taking 5th place after having trained up that way. And really importantly, backing away from my kids, this Milwaukee Bay activity, now 30 years old, has attracted so many women, so many adult women newcomers, that now what they do is get together every spring and have an all-women's 4-day-long sailing symposium at our sailing center, which is our sailing school. They rent the classroom. They fill it up, they bring speakers in, they bring in sailmakers, they have all sorts of famous women. Betsy Allison, of course, has been here, and others. And they get together and celebrate the sport, and it just continues to grow. And of course, the men are invited, but as spectators. This is my view. I go out on Mondays with a friend, we cook up some burgers, we take some photographs, and we're essentially not allowed to do the sailing, but we can send a good scent. And so let's talk a little bit about how this woman is different, in this newcomer to our sport is different. There are really four principal ways. I mentioned that it's been an explosion of new participants. These are not people that came in via clubs and associations and fleets. They are women who start as adults, unlike generations of sailors, usually about the age of 30, as opposed to the age of 15 or 8, as we might think. And so what that means is that all of the sailing programs that we've built up, all of the infrastructure we've created through US Sailing and through all of our clubs and through all of our associations usually miss her. The way it usually begins, imagine this story: 32-year-old woman, maybe a mom of a 6-year-old, moves to a new town after a divorce for a job with her kid. Sees boats on the water, has weekends to herself now, but also a kid, says, I'd like to learn how to do that, goes to a sailing center, takes a class, becomes familiar, joins the women's team, and maybe begins to pull in her own kids in a shared fleet program. But usually that means that our clubs and our associations miss her. She's not even really sure there is a US Sailing, to be frank. She's also not really sure there's a fleet, or that there is something called One Design, or that there is a club that might welcome her, because those clubs still look all male and still look like they're closed gated. And also, it's really important to point out that all of this, the schedules that we've put together, schedules for regattas and schedules for training and schedules for her own education, there's a curriculum mismatch. Our sailing schools are organized around 9-year-olds, not 35-year-old women, right? So she has to find a way to train up. And what she is an opportunity to retool our thinking about education and modernize our a major change. This is a group of newcomers that really sidestep the infrastructure we've created. So let's look at how deeply disruptive that means she is. She doesn't find sailing through clubs or fleets. She finds sailing through social networks and usually schools. She wants to train up first because she wants to be competent in the area of safety and then decent at sailing. And frankly, that means she bypasses the clubs and the junior programs. And that means that there's a mismatch in goals and culture. And so the opportunity we need to think about here is that since she shows up via social networks, that means she can arrive in groups of 1 or 2 or 3 women, groups of 1 or 2 or 3 women with their kids, which has a multiplier effect on the fleets and the number of people who are participating. And she's aspirational. And what I mean to say here is, one of the things, I'm going to back up and say, one of the things about the US Sailing video that Jim shared that came out last week is that it talks about taking a lifetime of the sport. And I completely agree that that's a necessity. It's really important to pitch this activity as something that you can do all life long. But what that means is you have to have people who actually care about doing it all life long. And so the beautiful thing about this newcomer group is that once she's in, she's really motivated to do more of it. She wants to stick with it. And in fact, she's adapting her life schedules to it. She's finding out ways to carve out Saturday afternoons or Sunday mornings for these activities, or Tuesday nights or Monday nights, like happens in my town. And she views this as a social outdoor and a character experience. And what that means is she's just got to get better and better at it. Teaching is part of the activity. She wants to not just learn, but teach. And what that means is our organizations, if they realize this opportunity is in front of them, don't just get students out of this new demographic, they get teachers out of this new demographic, which to me is the most exciting, one of the most exciting parts of the whole thing. And finally, she's inclusive. She's age, gender, and capabilities agnostic. In my racing experience, I'm old enough now and I've had enough racing experience to know that, you know, there's been this, I need to find exactly the right weight for my team. I need to find the right gender for my team. I need to find the right skill set or experience or strength for my team. I need somebody who who's done the bow before, because if they do, then I win more. Well, this new demographic, this new adult woman entering the sport comes in and says, I really don't care how much you know or I know. Let's just all get out on the water and have an experience. And that's a really healthy and fresh way of thinking about entering the sport. The emphasis is on a social experience, not on a competitive experience. And there's an aspiration to see and be and live and lead and share among this group. And so the opportunity is that sailing is seen by this group as a platform for leadership, that is learning ways to parent or learning ways to involve sisters or moms or dads or brothers because of this inclusive nature of this group. Ironically, and Jim has seen this, heard me talk about this before, she's really here to mentor friends, mentor herself, mentor each other. This is a self-care, group care thing. And ironically, we usually say this when we study the classics, but the story of mentor is one that needs to be told here. So the word mentor is usually given to mean an old man, a wise old man who helps young people find their way. But the real story of mentor is a Greek myth in which Athena, the beautiful, young, powerful goddess, was unable to convince a young man to follow her into battle, but she thought that the young man's name was Telemachus. She thought that he would make a good warrior. Would she be able to give him the appropriate training? And so Telemachus didn't think that he could learn from a woman. But in fact, what Athena decided to do is take on the form of an old, kind of crotchety old loser of an old man named Mentor. And Mentor and Telemachus worked together to make Telemachus a great warrior. And then Athena, the young woman, exposed herself as the actual mentor. And that's how we get the word mentor in the English language. It's because a woman was doing the work. And so I'm going to leave you with 2 more data points, and then I'm going to stop talking, and we can just do some questions, some Q&A. We've spent a lot of time talking about a new demographic, and demographic is a word used in marketing, right? And in marketing, we also want to think about media and messages and ways that people can be exposed to sailing. And so I wanted to just play with the idea that media may or may not matter to this woman, or frankly, to sailing at all. And so what I did is I took Google searches and I charted them on this chart in the years 2011, 2012, and 2013. And so what you can see on this chart is that the Google searches for the word sailing actually go up every season in between April and, say, August, and then they decline in the winter, as you would expect they would. But there was an America's Cup in these 3 years, and so I just want to ask you to look at this chart and say to yourself, do you see where the America's Cup happened? because the America's Cup has always been viewed as the great magnet to sailing, right? Anybody want to, raise their hand and take a shot and say, do you see where the America's Cup is? Everybody sees the peak in red, right? The fact is the America's Cup didn't happen in 2012. It happened in 2013. The America's Cup is actually the B. That's the peak created in media attention to sailing from the America's Cup. It matters not at all is the way we need to think about it. And so you might ask, well, what is that red peak in 2012? And the answer is 2012 is when we had the Olympics. And I don't remember in the 2012 Olympics, but there was this video that got posted to YouTube in which an Irishman did a talkover on a laser start of the starting line, and it went viral as a video because it was so ridiculous. I don't know if you remember, but people were starting backwards and the guy had no idea what was going on. And so the word sailing was searched in 2012 because of a viral joke video, not because of the America's Cup. And so media in a traditional sense doesn't really matter. That's the way we need to think about it. In a less traditional sense, I think it's actually quite important. And here's what I mean by that. The fact is that we are now all carrying these cameras, and these cameras and all of the tools for sharing our experiences make it possible to share what we're doing. And so the new demographic, these women, especially entering as adults, are sharing their experiences socially. And that's how media matters in this new world. It's with essentially selfies and self-production and sharing among social groups. I'm going to leave you with a couple of ideas. There are some model organizations, I think, taking advantage of these new developments in sailing, and they do 4 things really well. These are associations and schools and clubs that really have their eye on the ball, who are growing themselves, who are really making major investments in helping more people to live this wonderful life. And they do 4 things. The first is they're experiential. They don't do classroom training. They get people on the water immediately. Everybody gets a life jacket on, and then they go sailing. And that's just an absolute, it's about the experience, be on the water. That's where the love happens. And then with mentors. So people with experience are partnered with people without experience so that there's a transfer of knowledge. Those mentors draw an aspirational path by teaching the younger people or the less experienced people to teach. And the reason is that the goal is to create a leadership continuum. That's what sailing does so well. It helps teachers become teachers. It helps leaders become leaders. It helps sailors become sailors. And that's the way we did it in the 1960s and 70s, and it's why we're all still here today. And so here is our opportunity to take advantage of that. And with that, what I'd like to do is open it up for discussion and questions.
Nick, I appreciate that. Here's, I think, the easiest way to handle this. I'm going to play with fire here, and I'm going to unmute everybody. So if you behave, you can go one at a time. If you don't behave, I'm going to mute you all, and you don't have to raise your hand like you're in grade school. So let's try that and see if that works, if I can push all the right buttons. Okay. So the way this works is, this isn't going to work. Plan B.
I am very sorry that I wasn't.
It was a nice thought, wasn't it, Nick? Anyway, let's do this. Nick and I will converse a little bit, and you guys pop in on the chat line. And if you guys are, want to chat longer, Nick's there. If you don't want to chat, we can go from there. Nick, one of the things that struck me from I've read the book and heard you speak before is it looks like all the growth is in both non-traditional segments, meaning probably and we'll call it women, as well as non-traditional organizations. Talk about, say, the Sailing Center in Milwaukee, how that's different from your traditional yacht club.
Great, that's a good question. The Sailing Center is You know, I mentioned that it began 30 years ago with some seed money from Harkin to put in a dinghy facility. And the dinghy facilities, I have to admit, I was not a dinghy sailor. So I've always been a big boat, keelboat sailor. But I've hung around enough of them to know that that there were a bunch of dinghy-like organizations. The one in Annapolis, everybody knows Stuart, the doctor's, the author was from Severin. Yes, exactly. Stuart Walker. What was the name of his club? Anyway, it doesn't matter. It's a dinghy club. The idea of the dinghy clubs were really inexpensive storage. Get a time, Severin. There you go. Thank you very much. Get a lot of time on the water and do travel regattas in between those clubs. And that's the way our sailing center started as well, as a 420, 470 club. But then it became really important to begin to be a school. So a curriculum was developed, and we had a lease with the city that necessitated that we offer some give back to school kids. So we created a scholarship program and put in place two things: a youth program around dinghies, and then an adult sailing program in which we would train up adult newcomers on keelboats. And the way that it worked is $25 a month, and once you got your rating, you could use the same ensigns, the keelboats you were trained on, as long as there was one available, first come, first serve, from dawn to dusk on Milwaukee Bay. And so we now have, I believe, 80 boats in our fleet. The biggest fleet of ensigns in the country is at this location. It's still $25 a month. There are winter seminars and a class, and the whole thing is not for profit. And we crank through about 4,000 volunteer hours a year, about 700 members a year. We have a high rate of transients, but frankly, what happens is somebody comes in, takes a beginner class, sails the ensigns for a year, takes an advanced class, jumps on some solings for a while, finally realizes they want to race in some other way or buy a boat and go cruise, and they do that and they move on. And so when they move on, they graduate out of the program into some other sailing activity, and that's a fine outcome for that organization. So it's a very different model than a sailing club. It has its roots more in the kind of dinghy sailing that I think your association understands intuitively, because it was designed around that at the very beginning.
Yeah, Nick, yeah, appreciate it. Nick, and for those of you who went to Newport, Sail Newport, probably the counter of that, and in New Orleans as one start. Nick, question came in. I'm going to rephrase Gail's question. Is anytime you're a new demographic in something, you always meet resistance. How do you get over the resistance? I'll oversimplify it here. Women shouldn't be on a boat. How do you overcome? How have folks worked through that roadblock?
Yeah, it's a tough one, Gail. I can see your actual text in your question, and I empathize.
My answer was better. I was just being nice.
Yeah, that's nice. That's good, Jim. Here's what I think. I think a couple things about this. The first is what happened in Milwaukee is a really refreshing thing, and it speaks to the way that this demographic is entering the sport. She wants to do it. She's going to do it. And if the clubs are in the way, that's their problem. If the clubs are not in the way, then the clubs have an opportunity to benefit. So in my mind, a couple things need to take place. First is every club that we have really doesn't have a chance to continue with the old model. It's not sustainable. The old model is not sustainable. And so I believe that any club that survives the next 20 years is a club that transforms itself into a school. And if it transforms itself into a school, it's going to be a school not just for kids, but also for adults. And that means it's going to include this new demographic, the very interested 35-year-old woman, newcomer to a city who'd like to try this. And so I believe that clubs that survive are the ones that they're not just going to be convinced. They're not going to be around if they don't get on board and support this change. It's that significant.
In fact, I would say Darwin would say adapt or die.
Exactly.
In fact, and I had a boss one time that he had, and what will happen, I had a boss one time, we were debating different sales channels and which one he liked the best. You know what his answer was? More. And then I think what you basically said there, Nick, if clubs want to thrive and survive, the real answer is more. And now I like the point you made, competitive instinct says, okay, if the Jackson Yacht Club doesn't want to do it, somebody else is going to do it, and we're going to wish we had.
And also, just taking away, taking another angle on that, Jim. There are two clubs in my town in a sailing school, but both clubs have a school too. And so I just think that if there are 1,700 viable yacht clubs in North America right now, and every single one of them has a really solid curriculum around all age groups, that's a good thing, not a bad thing. It's not a competitive thing. What it is it's a gas station on every corner, right? And the sport benefits from all of the opportunities to go sailing. So it's that I think that's the way that you get through this.
Jim, can I make a comment?
Go ahead.
What impacted me about the ladies were their big smiles. And I think not merely were they sailing, but they were chatting throughout the whole race. So in looking at the Flying Scot, we generally race two people. So what I think is really critical is either before we go out on the water or after we go out on the water, we've got to have a get together with the people who go out on the water and have a breakfast, a lunch, something like that. We don't sail big boats. I mean, I do at times sail big boats, but I'm saying tonight we're talking about the Flying Scot. And the way to help save it or make it better is to make sure lunch or breakfast is part of it for the ladies so they can chit chat and have a good time. And I think we should start leaning towards the 73-year-old young ladies.
In fact, to your point, one of the things I didn't appreciate at the time, and if there are any folks from North Carolina there, we always had, back when you could have beer at a public park, and my dad always enjoyed that, probably because he enjoyed the beer, but he said, you know what, one day you're going to enjoy the social aspects more than the sailing. You'll be an old man. But the point you raised, and we all got to remember, if it's just doing something, you can go take a hike, literally, or ride a bicycle. But I think, Nick, and the rest of us, you think about it, it's connections you build up. Looking at some of the folks on here, I've known some of these folks since I was, before I drove cars. And I think that's what we have to foster, that community, and don't lose track of. Nick, you probably also saw some questions about volunteerism. You want to speak to those?
I do, and I also want to just applaud the last point about making sure that you organize social events. I want to tell you that the Milwaukee Bay Women's Offshore Series, which is six races on Mondays in the summers and a championship, they are not club affiliated. They didn't come from one club; they came from two and the Sailing Center. And what they do after every single Monday night is all meet for a dinner at one of the locations, and the dinner takes as long or longer than the racing does. There's a debrief. There's tons of talk about what happened at a mark rounding, and then exactly. And so I completely agree that it's a terrific idea to bookend these things with food and socials, and and that's just key. The thing about volunteering, yes, I agree that in most kind of infrastructure-based clubs now, clubs with restaurants and clubs with big budgets, and also clubs that have mixed themselves up, social memberships and power memberships and all that stuff, that it's fallen on the shoulders of the last few people who really love it to do the race committee, for example. But I would also say that in these organically organized events like the Milwaukee Bay Women's Series, which continues to be organically organized after 30 years, it's either a potluck, or it's you got to volunteer to do race committee on a schedule. Everybody is asked in these low budget organizations to step in and participate in some way. And I think that the healthier the volunteer, the more spread out the volunteer load is, the healthier the organization is. It becomes it's the membership fee, a few hours in the season. So I think it's really an important thing to get a schedule out and do that. I want to tell this story because I think it's a beautiful one of a very special location, a very special sailing center I'm aware of in California, off the it's called the Cal Sailing Center, and it's a marina just down the hills from Berkeley, from UC Berkeley, east of San Francisco Bay. And very quickly, I'll just tell this quick story. This is an organization that was formed as a student sailing. They couldn't make it work financially. So about 25 years ago, they said anybody could join off the street. It costs you $25 a month. That's the membership fee. And what they do is they have exactly one paid staff, and it's a part-time accountant. They have one office with a calendar on the wall, and they've got a yard in which they have a shared fleet of equipment. They spend all of their membership money on their insurance and on boats. And every boat there is a shared craft. They've got planing dinghies and windsurfers and all sorts of San Francisco Bay appropriate equipment. What you do there, you don't take a class on a schedule like showing up on a Tuesday. You show up as a brand new newcomer and you say, I want to learn to sail. And the first day I'm available to go on my first class is Tuesday at 9 a.m. And then a veteran sailor from the same organization puts their name on that spot for Tuesday at 9 a.m. And then a couple of other people who are further along in their training put their name on it, and 4 people go sailing on Tuesday at 9 a.m. So the schedule is completely fluid. And what you do is you get in about 8 hours of training on water. All of it's on water. All the life jackets, all the wetsuits are all supplied by the membership dues. By the time you're done with 8 hours, you now have rights to take out any one of those boats or participate in one of those training programs. And frankly, you're also obliged to be a member on a boat during a training program and learn how to train yourself. And they just keep that volunteer cycle moving forward. Everybody pays $25, including the teachers, and it just keeps going and going and going, and they just keep buying boats and having great fun sailing. So that's an organization, in my mind, that is just built volunteerism into its model. It's the way that it works. So the next question is, can I speak about challenges and strategies with smaller clubs and memberships with lack resources? Yeah. I just want to say the potluck concept is so important, and so is a van load of people all moving in a direction. I feel like if COVID is teaching us anything right now, it's that small groups, moving in small groups and figuring out ways to share and cooperate is a good thing. And I'm just betting that that it will be a relief at a small club to insist upon potluck food sometimes, or to insist upon folks to sign up to be drivers for a group who wants to head to someplace. I think there are all sorts of beautiful strategies in scheduling, in asking for participation in that way that turn out to be an asset for a small organization. And Nancy's question, no, I'm afraid that NYC and South Shore are not potlucks, but the Sailing Center is one. They pay the clubs to make them. Actually, they pay the clubs to serve them whatever they have left in the coolers nights when they go to the two other clubs. Good question.
Nick, I think we're about ready to wrap it up. But if you were advising our group out there to say each one of them come from all over the country, or at least all over our population, and I think the real answer is they all want more people to go sail with, more friends. What would you tell them to do other than just go do something?
So I want to leave you with this thought. I spent a good hour with Jim planning this talk and trying to understand what the Flying Scots were all about. And I had a general sense for the idea of the travel to regatta, one design fleet, and two people on board. But it was really fun to dig in and understand the history of multiple manufacturers, and now one left, and the Flying Scot Association and the manufacturer really being in partnership, and really folks loving their boats and caring for them, and trying to make a go of it. A couple things really struck me. The old original marketing for the boat suggested both it being a family day sailor, but also being able to be raced by a husband and wife team. And I thought that was a brilliant thing to be thinking about back in the early days, and to be continuing to build upon. And I also thought it was really cool that it's a husband and wife team that owns the manufacturing operation. Specifically, I want to say wife and husband team that owns the manufacturing operation. That to me is an inspiration to a whole bunch of folks. It's an asset that the association can be taking advantage of, and it's a way of living that I think you guys have 50, 60 years of experience with that can be built upon. So I would leave you with this idea. Let this become gender agnostic at a minimum, and women-led at a maximum. And you've only got the sky's the limit, essentially. It's a beautiful opportunity, I think, and you're really well positioned. So that's what I would leave you with.
Thank you, Nick. I guess the only thing I would add to it, and whatever we do, as long as we make it fun, the rest of the stuff works itself out. Because I think you said that about these folks you were talking about. If they're fun, they're going to want to do it, and they're going to beat your doors down. If it's painful, they got other things to go do. I just got a request about the data. I'm going to, I'm recording this, and I'll make this available to it. Depending on how quickly WebEx turns this stuff around. So, Nick, looks like you and I are going to be in cyberspace forever. So,
okay, Jim, I look forward to it. That's just fine.
And no doubt some nice guy in the Ukraine will think we're up to something else. But anyway, hope to see everybody on the water soon. If not, maybe we'll have some virtual happy hours and play woulda, coulda, shouldas. But anyway, hopefully everybody's enjoyed Nick. I've always enjoyed talking with him. Go buy his book, learn from it, and if you run across things that work, tell him, and he'll share the religion. So that being said, good night, folks.
Good night, guys. Thanks a bunch. Thank you all. It was really fun. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.